Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Paolo Ciuccarelli. I'm the director of the Center for Design, and welcome. Just a few words to remind that 1 year ago, next slide, please, Angelica, this very day, we were in a totally different setting for the inaugural event of the Center for Design. And I think it's not just a coincidence in time. I still have a vivid memory of the excitement around the interdisciplinary nature of design and the centrality of the human in the keynote speech about data and design. Next slides, please. A speech by Giorgia Lupi that was also the inaugural lecture of a very fortunate but unexpectedly short series. Here we are, 1 year later, kicking off a series of conversations on interdisciplinary design research that will span over the whole year. And that starts with a session that seems like an ideal continuation of that first discussion around data humanism. Without further ado, I leave the stage to the Center for Design curator and moderator of this session, Dietmar Offenhuber, and to the great lineup of speakers that he invited. Thank you, Dietmar. Thank you all the speakers. Thank you, Angelica, and all the team for the organization. And thank you everyone connected here. I hope to have the chance to see you again in person, hopefully soon. Dietmar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paolo. Let me share. So, yes, thanks everyone for joining us today. So data objects and practices such as physicalization, materialization, or visualization, there are many names, experiencing currently a surge in interest. And I think just the interest around this event is another example of that. And just to give you an example of the kind of thing that we are talking about, this is a traveling installation exhibition by the undocumented migration project that shows the, not just the number, but basically shows all the cases, all the migrants who have died trying to cross the border between Mexico and Arizona over the past decades. And so the designers have used these toe tags as a way to represent the data. What is interesting, so this exhibit has been shown in many different places across the country. And each time it is shown, a group of volunteers get together in workshops and write each individual toe tag with the name and the circumstances of the death of this victim. So this process of representing this data set also becomes a commemorative performative act. And I think this is just one example of what these kind of data physicalization practices are focusing on and trying to do. And I think everyone who is in design education and data visualization can also notice that the students are really interested in this topic. There are a lot of examples, and I'm reminded like 15 years ago when computer animation students started exploring stop motion and other traditional techniques. But I think there is much more to it than just nostalgia for the analog, because I think there are a couple of fundamental issues that were often neglected earlier in the data visualization discourse. And I just want to briefly mention 4 different issues that I think are relevant here. First, I think is that touch is a really underestimated sensory modality. And yeah, it apparently took a pandemic to remind us about how much we rely on touching things and being close to others. And this is a really interesting recent psychological experiment that found that haptic exploration of objects generates really long-lasting and accurate memories. So in this experiment, blindfolded participants haptically explored household objects such as spoons. And 2 weeks later, they were able to identify the particular spoon among almost identical other spoons. So this is something they were not able to do visually. So it shows that, you know, feeling the texture and the haptic exploration of object is a really powerful thing for cognition and for memory. I think it's also about a shift in understanding of what data visualization is about. And this is a slide that I took from a paper by Dan Lawton. I don't know if he's going to talk about this project, but traditionally, data visualization has been all about one person exploring a data set and trying to find meaningful patterns. But it turns out that this role of the mind is somewhat exaggerated. And visualization is much more about having shared objects that represent ideas that can be discussed together in a social setting. You know, like this whole topic of external representations is much bigger than just pattern recognition. And I think even more fundamentally, physicalization also forces us to rethink what we mean by this concept data. Traditionally would think about abstract numbers that describe things out there in the world, but data are always also objects, and you can ask any archaeologist or marine biologist for the purpose, as in this case, this is an image from project Skye Murray, who's on the panel, worked on. So I think physicalization gives us an opportunity to think about, you know, not just mapping a data set to you know, some kind of physical material or form, but also think about it as a practice that deals with the materiality of data itself, regardless of, you know, whether there's a data set behind it or not. And I think all of that has wide-ranging implications for our current situation. We find that digital data and charts alone are not sufficient in addressing misinformation around, you know, vaccines or elections. We always need material evidence. This is a slide. This is just a snapshot from a project that Laura and myself and two students, Yukeli and Björn, are working on, where we are trying to register the way how people touch objects and surfaces using this kind of UV fluorescent materials, tracer materials. So we think that these kind of practices around physicalization give us the tools to really think about effective ways of revealing material evidence, rather than just basically translating numbers into, you know, objects and things like that. So I want to introduce our speakers, and it's a really exciting panel that is really very much focused on these and other questions. Our first group is Rahul Bhargava and Laura Perovic. They're both assistant professors in CAMD. Rahul is a researcher, designer, and facilitator who works on data storytelling and technology design in support of social justice and community empowerment. So he creates big data research tools to investigate media attention, build hands-on interactive museum exhibits, and runs workshops around topics of data cultures, data culture newsrooms, nonprofits, and libraries. So he collaborated with a wide range of groups. Laura is an assistant professor also in art and design. Her research focuses on ways to create physical, contextual, and interactive experiences around data that can help people understand and act on big social challenges. So her data physicalizations are informed by research in information visualization and human-computer interaction, and often address environmental issues such as air pollution, water pollution. So she's also very much influenced by environmental art and seek to create emotionally resonant knowledge producing and community building experiences with data and people. Laura and Rahul, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much for in that introduction. So my name is Rahul Bhargav. I sort of got that short introduction. Maybe while I get the slides shared, Laura, you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, and I'm Laura Perovich.
Okay, so we want to talk about a project that we've sort of brought here and launched here that is thinking about embodying information. And we're part of this lovely team of folks that's listed here on this slide, amazing folks from across disciplines that are helping us explore this idea of doing that thing that that Dietmar just mentioned, trying to think about how people embody information and what the different traces and interactions that we offer are. And I want to open with just a story about something that's happened in one of our recent workshops where we're trying to think about data, dance, and theater and how those come together. And this is just a quote from one of our participants that I think really starts to reveal some of what we're getting at. We're in a virtual workshop where we were trying to explore what we can do around creating theatrical experiences that are driven and structured by data, that are about bringing people together around data, and about reinterpreting and storytelling data. And they made this quote that said, it says here, you are translating your math mind into a creative mind, into a story mind, and then at the end, into a people mind. And I think that speaks really, really in a lovely way to sort of what we're trying to pull apart here by trying to reset the power agenda within data and sort of who's studied, who is the studier, and how we can engage people. So with that quote in the back of your head, we want to spend a minute just talking about where we're coming from, how this work is going, and then where we want to go next to explore these topics. So what's our motivation here? Our motivation is that data is becoming more and more central to how we understand and interact with the world around us. We have a group of people that know how to speak data, depicted in this slide, mostly people that are in official positions, particularly in civic settings. There are experts there who sort of speak the language of data, and anyone who doesn't speak that language is left out of any processes that center that. So whether that be civic planning, whether that be questions of justice and equity, whatever they are, if you don't speak that language of data, you can't participate in that conversation. And that, from a justice point of view, is disempowering very actively. And that's a real motivator for our work. We want to come up with different ways to bring people into that. So the standard way is some kind of spreadsheet training with some technological tool. And to huge amounts of people, that just puts them right to sleep. So we want to find new ways to bring people together around data to get them a seat at the table. And on the flip side, offer the experts and those in power a new way to engage with those traces of our activity. So our approaches are to meet people where they are. Here's a couple of images of our work. It often means moving off screen into more tangible experiences. You heard about some of that in Dietmar's opener, whether it be experiences like Laura creates, artifacts, artistic engagements like this data mural, or workshop activities in more educational settings. So this is kind of the language that we bring to people. It's not the language of a spreadsheet on a screen. I'll hand it off to Laura to continue.
Great, so we're really excited now to be building off of this prior work and doing some early experiments in the space of movement. Specifically, we're taking the lens of theater and dance as a space for exploring data. And we've been lucky to be doing this work with support from seed grant funding from CfD. Next slide. So our research builds on a significant history of work in many different spaces. One of these spaces is participatory theater. So in particular, the work in the theater of the oppressed that look to use theater for civic change and as a way to empower the public. Paulo Freire's work is also really informs a lot of what we do. So his focus on popular education and situational pedagogy that leads towards active and impactful goals. Within computer science and the data visualizations fields as well, as Dietmar mentioned, there's this increasing interest in data physicalization. Broadly, we might think about this as projects that take data off the screen and into the physical world. And while many of these projects do sort of put the visual interpretation into the forefront, there's also projects that look at things like taste, smell, and sound. We see a big opportunity here to design with somatic, tactile, and embodied experiences in the forefront. And that's what we're exploring in this project. So just to highlight a few examples in that space within data physicalization, The Embody Suit is a project that collects Internet of Things data and situates it on the body through haptic actuators. And Constraint City is an actuated vest that gives the wearer haptic feedback on the Wi-Fi in the city. So the weaker the Wi-Fi signal, the more that it squeezes you. And I think that's a really gives a hint at the power of embodiment and physicalization. The fact that you're feeling that data as you walk through the space is a really different experience than looking at it on a graph. Great, so I'll hand it off to you, Rahul, for this one.
So those examples kind of give a sense of where we're coming from, but there is, as I spoke to earlier, sort of this techno-fetishization around data, and we particularly see it in some of our. We situate some of our work in the computer and human interaction space, and some of that doesn't really align with the goals and the audiences we're talking to. So these are some of our key goals, things like empowerment, expressivity, understanding, and engagement. This list of things really drives us meeting these audiences where they are, whether it be people that are excited to learn data literacy for some goals they want to achieve, performers who are thinking about constantly the material around them and how they can engage with it and express with it. As I mentioned earlier, a very focused role on like civic engagement and how we bring people into that as a way to structure how and where we live. And then of course, educators and researchers that we collaborate with. So that's kind of where we're coming in and coming from. So this started a while back with some of these collaborators. This is a photo of Laura and our friend Rosalie and Vicky, who's still a collaborator, trying stuff out and that's kind of where we started, right? Getting together in space to try out some activities that try to engage this language. And this is kind of where we ended up, is in Zoom rooms like you see in the background here right now. So this is some things from our initial activity. We've designed, with the help of our team, 2 initial workshops that we've tried out over the last month. And we want to share a little bit about what we've learned so far. The one that I led was on the theater front. So with my collaborators, Jesse and Amanda, thinking about how we can create a set of activities to bring theaters, in this case, theater students, to try to help us co-design those activities to figure out how they work. Some findings from that, where we brought together a small group of students and ourselves to try out activities to create theatrical experiences based on data. One was we saw real evidence of overcoming barriers to math thinking. If you've done any work with data with people that aren't sort of domain experts, the first thing you hear is, oh, I don't do numbers, I don't do math. And there's lots of ways to overcome that. We found already, as you can see from this quote, that like we're making a transition with these engagements. So looking at a piece of data and the numbers and the quantitative stuff, but what's the story? And I thought that was really fun. So this invitation to engage was shifting that mindset a little bit to overcome that barrier in a lot of settings where people don't feel like, or they've been told they're not math people. A second finding was this key one that Dietmar spoke to earlier. The data is material evidence of people, right? Like it's grounded in the actual people, was something one of our participants said. So we start to see some evidence in this quote and others that story, the human angle, is coming in. A third one, the idea that this resonates with theater and the way it thinks about the world, finding and telling multiple stories from any seed that comes in, whether it's data or not. And then the idea that like, this is like theater, this type of data storytelling. Like you either buy into it, and you buy into it when you buy into it. There's no way you force someone to come into it. So that muscle that theatrical people have is coming into play here. And that's actually causing reflection about if there's cognitive models in the world of theater or normal model or sort of normed models in theatrical thinking that might create certain affordances for how we bring people together around data to tell stories in more powerful, impactful ways. I'll hand it back to Laura to talk about some of the dance results.
Yeah, so I ran a dance workshop with Ilya and Nicole, and we saw a lot of parallel and complementary findings to what we saw in the early theater workshop as well. So like the data theater workshop, we saw that people are bringing their past experience with data and with math into this space. And that part of what we can do is sort of impact that and challenge that in some ways to shape a new experience. In particular, with our group, this played out in 2 particular ways. So we saw that no matter what people's background was with math and data, they quickly started to reflect on how data attitudes can be limiting. In particular, looking at how a focus on accuracy and precision might be hiding some of the other stories that are actually more important in the information. We also saw our group reflecting on how design decisions in visualizations can really impact the interpretation of data. So for example, we had one exercise that used both a line graph and a bar chart. And people noted that depending on which one they looked at, their physical interpretation of the data was really different and gave them a different overall story. Finally, we saw some exciting hits at the potential of embodiment. So one data set we worked with had a really large variation in the information. And we saw that dancers really reacted to this change. So the fact that they had to enact these magnitudes physically made them feel it in a really particular way that might not have been mirrored if they were just looking at the graph visually. So after these explorations, there's a number of areas that we're really excited to pursue. So first, we're looking forward to continuing and strengthening our robust interdisciplinary conversations that are really central to this work. This includes conversations in theater, dance, and somatic practices, since these are all really complicated spaces, and we see there being many layers to unpack in understanding embodiment and perception of information through the body. So really excited to find more opportunities to collaborate and continue to work in these spaces. Second, we're looking forward to engaging with our community partners once the COVID emergency has slowed down a bit and these groups have more bandwidth to participate, because we really like to dive into these questions of civic impact together with this work. We're also looking forward to building our portfolio of activities and curricula in this space, in particular starting to look at some longer term workshops as an opportunity to increase the complexity of the activities that we're doing and start to measure some of these outcomes more robustly.
So I think thanks. That concrete example of sort of what we're trying to do, create these experiences, speaks to those underlying issues that we want to get at. The idea that these, very much in line with the sort of examples that we heard earlier, these externalizations of experiences, right, of these thoughts, of these understandings, in this case, in theatrical and physical dance motion, these kind of centered experiences is really a space where we can try to bring people together to understand and represent and tell their own experience and their own story. And to us, that's sort of the underlying question, is how we can create more experiences like that in really interesting and impactful ways. So this is the sort of the start of where we're going with that and sort of some of the underlying goals. I think that you can see already there's connections to some of the themes. And with that, we'll bring it to a close to keep time for other folks and some good discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rahul and Laura. So there will be a lot to discuss, but we will move on right to the next presentation and then have a discussion afterwards. And I think at that point, I also wanted to thank the audience for submitting such provocative and super interesting questions that would actually like fill a whole semester-long program in itself. And just glancing across the list of participants in this Zoom meeting, there are also a lot of people in the audience who could answer these kind of questions very well. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. But for now, I want to introduce Skye Murray. Skye is assistant professor at the Pacific Northwest College of Art in Portland, Oregon. And I should also add, she's an alum of our information design and visualization program. She believes in the power of visualization and meaningful engagement in bridging the gap between two traditional polar disciplines, design and science. So she's an oceanographer, and her work investigates the complex relationships between humans, technology, and nature. Creates work that encourages curiosity, empathy, and interaction, and explores these themes through data-driven design and visual storytelling. Please welcome Skye.
Thank you, Dietmar. All right. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Data physicalization is something that I've only begun to become really excited about in the last few years. I called this presentation Skimming the Surface versus Diving In, because as Dietmar mentioned, I've spent a lot of time doing oceanography before becoming a designer. And I now feel like I'm not one versus the other, I'm kind of both now, but I spend a lot of time sailing the high seas, teaching oceanography to undergraduates, and also, as you can see in this case, sailing in the Southern Ocean with the US Antarctic program. And, you know, we think about the ocean just generally as this big, broad, ubiquitous, 70% of the planet. But in fact, if you spend a lot of time there, even without doing science, every day is different. The ocean looks different. It's a different color. And if you start to, put little gizzies and instruments in the water and start understanding what is actually happening with the sea temperature, salinity, you have a very different picture of what's going on under the surface, what lives there. When you start dragging nets and using different instruments, you can really gain a broader perspective of this very layered and rich, very non-homogeneous surface of our planet. And if you are, whether you're on a ship or off a ship, if you're looking at some of these, even weather charts, for example, what's happening, if you're looking at some of these data representations over the surface of the ocean, on that, here you see the tip of Chile and the top of the Antarctic Peninsula. Here we see these isometric, these bands of weather charts and of wind, and they're showing barometric pressure. And if anybody knows anything about wind charts, the closer these lines are together, the more wind you have. And the lower these numbers are, with a big L, as we know from kind of hurricanes and tropical cyclones, the more dangerous it is. So I know from looking at these a lot over my life that when you see these bands get really close together, low pressure, start moving towards you, and especially in the Southern Ocean, when you see these, if we often transit between Chile and Antarctica, you start seeing these big red areas that are 26, 28 foot seas or more. That to me, it's a very embodied experience where, it's the motion of the ocean is not for everyone, and it makes for a very rough 4-day transit as you're sailing across. And so in my kind of 8 years, 80 some odd thousand miles, nautical miles, which are longer, at sea, we've been collecting plastic, plankton, and about the same time as I started hearing about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, in the Pacific, I knew that we had seen a lot of these places in the Atlantic and even in the Pacific, and it wasn't some kind of landfill you could walk on. Most of the pieces are smaller than your fingernail. And we published a lot of the kind of 7,000 net toes worth of data in 2010 in the Atlantic, and looked at kind of the amounts of plastic we were seeing, and the, kind of by proxy, how much plastic, according to EPA municipal solid waste reports, is at least the United States producing. And it didn't really add up, and it's very difficult for people to understand what these graphs mean, kind of in the physical experience. And so over the years, published more and more papers, and realized that to this day, one thing that, these papers have been cited, I don't know, 1,500 plus times. But one thing that people just don't understand is this kind of, the plastic just isn't magically appearing in the open ocean. It comes from specific countries. And we're all complicit, part of this problem. But, plastic doesn't start out being the size of your fingernail. It starts out as big pieces. And so what I want to really just talk about to you for a few minutes today is a project that I completed with Moritz Stefaner and Lena Klaus. Moritz is an amazing data visualization designer, incredible projects. I think he's here in the audience. And then Lena Klaus lives in Bali and Hong Kong, and she's an incredible marine debris artist, primarily doing her work on beaches. And so this is her picture kind of showing the degradation of a very common single-use plastic. We use it for a couple months in these places. It breaks, it degrades, it goes away. And so for a few minutes here, I'm going to talk about this project called Perpetual Plastic that the three of us worked on for as part of the National Geographic Ocean Plastic Innovation Challenge, the first innovation challenge. Everybody else mainly did browser-based projects in the data visualization track, but we chose to do a project that really focused on can we use the physical data, especially focusing on mismanaged waste. What is coming from these beaches that, from these islands that ends up in the ocean? And can we show contextually this data on a global scale? And so what we ended up doing after several months of preparation is on a beach in Bali. Prior to kind of us coming together, there are 3 beach cleanups by local people, and kind of putting together tons and tons of different colors, then organizing different colors of flip-flops and kind of doing a lot of math to understand how big we could make this physical installation on a beach at low tide. And so what this visualizes is a 2015 paper, and I'll show you the original graphic where by 2015, it's larger now, there were 8.3 billion metric tons of plastic that had been created on the planet. So just raw plastic petrochemical product created. And it's estimated in this paper from 2015 that 60% of that has been discarded, 6.8 has been recycled, 9 has been incinerated, and 24% is still in use. Now this number is now 9 billion, and you could see how plastic production is exponentially increasing over time. And so the original graphic in a scientific paper that is proprietary, you can't download it without having some kind of, I can't download it being at an arts institution. We don't have that library access. Only other scientists can really see these things, right? They're paywalled. And so what we tried to do is take this original graphic, which was published in Our World in Data, into a kind of a Sankey diagram. And more it's played with how can we put it into kind of, we all love circles, a half circle, and then allow some kind of, orient it so that the part that's coming from the river is in fact the amount of all plastic ever made. And this picture shows how, kind of was an accident, honestly, a happy accident, but it's kind of our favorite picture because it shows how this mismanaged waste, 60% of all waste is ending up potentially in the ocean. And though this is a very we had lots of drone footage, we're making a short film about it, it's a very aesthetic project. The point was that the representations of the data is in fact the actual single-use items in the data itself. Obviously, we can think about it on this mass scale, but also there are all these tiny kind of love Bali, plastic flip-flops, stories about the hotel slippers that don't really end up anywhere, don't have any real waste stream, kind of landfill direct managed system in Bali, and kind of what the rivers look like, cleanup looks like, and just the process of, you could create this graphic, right, visually on your computer as a single person, but the idea of doing this with a group was just incredible. And just the things you see when you're, how many toothpaste tubes there are, why are there all these on the beach, was really amazing. Next, in my world, I'm creating, soon to come to Toronto when Canada and museums open up again after COVID, is a project closer to home, at least in the United States, called Plastic Heart Service All the Way Through, about industrial plastic pollution in the Great Lakes. I've been working with a product designer to kind of take plastic that we commonly recycle, basically pelletize it, melt it into these data representations, these kind of plastic shards on a big map. Again, with the data itself, the data representations being made of something that is, either not going to be recycled or is used on a daily basis. And this, if when you're interested, or check it out online, this whole exhibit is really focusing on, plastic as an art material, a cultural object, a petrochemical product, a geologic process, because we see it intermingling with new rocks and volcanic islands, and then just, the synthetic material. A lot of this ends up in our bodies. And so all the different installations by various artists will focus on that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Skye. Let's move on to our last presentation before the discussion. I'm happy to introduce Dan Lockton. He is a designer who is interested in how understanding the world differently can help humanity in an age of environmental and social crisis. So he's currently assistant professor of industrial design in the Future Everyday group at Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands, and runs the Imaginaries Lab, a research through design studio. I think that he also founded in his previous position at Carnegie Mellon University and the Royal College of Art in the UK. Please welcome Dan. Thank you.
Thanks, Dietmar. Right, hang on, let me share my screen. Is that working okay? Yeah, I mean, it's supposed to have an animation, but my internet connection is not very good, so I don't think it's coming through very well. But so, I mean, my talk's not going to be as kind of beautiful, I think, as some of the things that Skye showed us. But I'm going to talk a little bit about, I suppose, some ways that I guess some of the, almost like the qualities of phenomena in the world can somehow be represented through what we might think of as a kind of data physicalization, but maybe it's also somehow about the way that we think about things in our mind as well, right? So how the links, I suppose, between the qualities of things in the world and how we actually imagine them. So I run this thing called the Imaginaries Lab, and all imaginaries really mean, I mean, it's a sociological term, but the way we use it is, or the way I've been using it really is around almost the kind of collective social ways that we think about and make sense of things. So what metaphors do people use to explain things they don't understand or things that are invisible, whether that's things like climate crisis or mental health or how AI works, all these kinds of things. What are the ways that people think about that? How do they tacitly or otherwise conceptualize these things, and how might that kind of be put into a form where we can share it and talk with each other about them? So I think there's this idea of kind of getting imaginaries out of people's heads and into a shared space so they can be discussed together. Now, maybe that doesn't sound like data, but hopefully I'll show how they kind of, I think there's relations between that. So I came to this partly from working with energy data, right? So I worked on a number of projects where we were doing, and this looks so mundane compared to what Skye just showed us, but we were looking at things like how people understand, energy monitors, and how do people make sense of numbers when they're presented to them. You should use less energy because, here's how much it costs you, or here's the carbon footprint of it. And there's a lot of work on this, right? On this kind of behavior change through sort of feedback of these kinds of things. And we found that through various projects, one of the big things that sort of became apparent was that energy is invisible, right? You see its effects, but the thing itself is a kind of invisible concept, and that had effects on the way people understood it. Whatever ways the data were presented in different kinds of graphs or interactive visualizations, it seemed like people's understanding was kind of there was a blockage because of this sort of invisibility of it. So one of the things we did, which maybe is sort of obvious, is we asked people to draw what they imagined energy looked like. So this was with colleagues at the RCA, led by Flora Bowden and myself. Like, we basically just asked people to draw what they thought it looked like. Now it's interesting; you get lots of interesting things from that, images of different kinds, some quite beautiful things as ideas as well. And the thing is, none of them is right or wrong. They're people's conceptualizations of this thing. Now we took it down a route of saying, okay, well, let's try and build on some of them. And we went down a route of doing various kinds of sonication, in case using bird song of different kinds around electricity use, which was not really that successful. But I think what it led us to was, or what it led me to, was thinking around metaphors a bit more. So, okay, so if something is an abstract concept or invisible, then perhaps we can only understand it really through metaphors, maybe, or maybe it's one way of doing that. So one area of work I've been doing the last few years is through trying to almost like produce ways for designers to come up with new metaphors for things, and whether that's about presenting data or explaining it, or whether it's around designing ways to explain concepts. You know, what if we thought of the economy as being more like a garden? Is a classic one that's often, you know, last few years, as a lot of people have suggested this idea. Or, you know, what if we thought of, you know, what if, you know, what if the future was, rather than being the road ahead of us, the future was more like, I don't know, a mosaic where there are lots of different tiles that fit together? How does that change the way we might think about that concept? And obviously data physicalization has used metaphors quite a lot in the way that at least some of the data phys work has used metaphors in different ways. One of the ways that we put this into practice in a kind of qualitative sense, I guess, was this idea of using landscape metaphors, things like hills and valleys and kind of trees and rivers and things, to enable groups of people or individuals, but mostly in groups, to kind of build ways to share their mental imagery, if you like, around abstract things. So this project, the mental landscapes work that Delaney Ricketts and I started doing, was mostly really around people visualizing their own kind of life journey or career development, if you like, initially in a physical landscape. You know, the hill might represent something. You might have a bridge from one area of your life to another. And then we did it with groups looking at, for example, this group of students trying to visualize what they perceived as like the future of humanity in a landscape by building this kind of shared representation with different things representing, you know, and the meaning is something that, you know, have to explain in context, right? I mean, it doesn't look like much when you see it, but as an activity, the process of collectively or collaboratively creating a kind of shared model of something and working out what is a metaphor for what do we think of, you know, do we think that the future is a, you know, a brick wall, or do we see it as more like a, you know, open landscape? What are those things? I think it can be an activity in itself to help make sense of these things. And so the project that Dietmar showed an image of earlier, this is something with colleagues, including people like Lisa Brawley, Laura Folano, and John Fass, who has done a lot of work on this. But also where we were trying to get people to, we were using this idea that different disciplines or different fields often use metaphors to describe them, right? You talk about, you know, I'm moving from one area into another. And so here we looked at interdisciplinarity through getting people to build models together of how they perceive their specialism or their field intersecting with others or joining onto others. And the key thing here from a physical point of view, or the kind of material evidence thing, if you like, was something that came from Manuela Aguirre, who's at AHO in Oslo, who had looked at how things like the actual material properties of bits of material were important in terms of physicalization. So it wasn't just that this piece of string represents joining one idea to another. The string itself, is it elastic? Is it rough? Is it sharp? Does it snap easily? Those properties themselves are kind of metaphors perhaps for how people think about the links between different ideas. And so some of the work with this was really, again, building collective models, but they did stuff. They were dynamic, they broke, or they had textures, or they were weak or strong. It's abstract when I talk about it in that way. It's a kind of almost abstract sort of expressionist sculpture, I guess. But we also did work here. This is a group of students who looked at mental health in a similar way. So getting people to build models using abstract elements to represent emotions that perhaps were difficult to put into words, but by building something and saying, okay, this thing, this ball in the middle represents me, the weight of these other things is on top of it, or this bit is fragile, this bit is strong. These kind of things enabled a kind of discussion around emotions that maybe were difficult to put into words. Now that might sound a long way from data physicalization, but I think it depends on what we define data to be, perhaps, right? It's obviously things that mean something to someone in themselves. So it's real in that sense, in a way of sharing it. So maybe just finally, because I'm aware I'm you know, running out of time with this, the thing I perhaps wanted to get to was this idea in general of considering qualitative data to be something which can be modeled and can be physicalized. And maybe that's obvious, but it hasn't always been part of the way people have thought about data physicalization. So we've done some work on what we sort of call qualitative displays or interfaces. And I don't think it's quite right, the term. And I think, I mean, Dietmar's done a lot of work that I think possibly has a more rigorously founded theoretical basis than what we did. But I think what you can see here, for example, is an energy monitor that we did that used sound and vibration. We tried to use vibrations themselves, given that, electricity is well, certainly AC, has frequencies to it, it has harmonics, it has all these things. Could we use the vibrations themselves to produce a kind of display directly? Which, it has no numbers, but I mean, it is proportional. If you actually, look at it, it is proportional to the electricity being used in this case. And I think there's a whole world of these things that actually make use of qualities in the world, perhaps directly or indirectly, as ways to understand data. The way that that water that's accumulated in the window of a train door in the bottom left there, has produced a kind of 3D real-time visualization of something about the movement of the train. And I think there's something interesting there that we perhaps ignore when we move directly to something else. So just finally, a couple of student projects on this idea. And this one particularly was inspired by the idea of autographic visualizations that Dietmar's written about. This was Nick Marotta, who's a student at Carnegie Mellon, who was interested in how groups of children collaborated together to play with blocks, right, or other kinds of things. And he realized that you could learn something about kind of group dynamics by giving children different colored blocks and seeing what they did with them, so that, they, in the sense, it produced a visualization of the interaction that different children had. So over time, if one person builds part of it, another person builds on top of it with their own colored blocks, it produces a visualization of that interaction. Someone else comes along, knocks it down, that is recorded as part of that. And that's sort of obvious, but it's a way of thinking about data physicalization that's slightly different, I think, to some of the other things. This was a way of, Jason Zhu's project here was around physicalizing people's heartbeat, their pulse rate, through an electromagnetic beating heart. You could actually you could experience someone else's heartbeat by holding this over an electromagnet that was producing or replicating the heartbeat of another person. And the idea here was that it actually was, it was a different way of physicalizing data around pulse. You could look at numbers, but this is a different way of visualizing it or physicalizing it in a kind of more experiential way. So I guess those are the sort of ideas, they're not necessarily very well connected together, but I think I just wanted to say with all of this that I think there's something about the qualities of things in the world themselves being a form of data that we don't necessarily always think about, and how that relates to our sort of mental models or mental imagery around concepts. I think it's something that's quite ripe for exploration in different directions by designers and researchers. And the paving slab there is just this basic idea that, the cracks in the paving are a physicalization of the history of the stresses in those slabs, right? And I don't know, there's something interesting about that in the way it's done. So I'll stop there, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Excellent. And I just briefly want to ask Angelica, how much time do we have? Because I think there's a lot to discuss.
We have until 1 p.m. We can, of course, go over a little bit, but,
Oh, I see. Okay.
It's completely up to, the presenters and everybody.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think because there are a lot of really, really good questions that were posed by the audience that I want to pass on, but also maybe quickly as a form of reflection or response to these excellent presentations. I found it really fascinating how these three presentations talked about very closely related things, but really highlighted very different aspects and perspectives. And I think all three dealt in a way with these tensions or these gaps that sometimes come up between, a perspective where we treat data as representations, as something that, points or references to something in the world, but is otherwise a sign, between data as an experience that somehow, is, experienced internally and externally. And third as data as a product of some kind of activity, of some interaction, of some process in the environment, and those things have all these different perspectives are overlapping, but they're also a little bit in conflict with each other at points. And so I found it really interesting, when starting with Rahul and Laura's presentation, where the performance and they talked about the skills of the theater performers to show, to represent certain things, or to embody certain ideas. And this is a topic that is very intensely debated in diagrammatics, where it's all about this relationship between gestures, like how we signal magnitudes, or how we show how big something is, and so on, and just working with gestures as to create shared objects of thought that multiple people can kind of have a conversation around. And with history, like choreographers like Bill Forsyth, who had dancers perform or show geometrical objects on the stage, and thinking about how these things relate. So I think this question of how gestural representations of data, I think, is really fascinating. Skye touched upon another really interesting aspect, is this question of how we also represent environmental phenomena such as weather or pollution versus how we experience it. And sometimes the wires seem to be crossed, because very often we experience the weather through our iPhone app, where we see, okay, it's gonna rain, or and then only as an afterthought we find ourselves in the middle of a rainstorm. And this kind of tension also in this experience of the ocean, I think is really brings that out very convincingly, because the atmosphere is disintegrated into all these atomistic numbers that somehow allow us to model it in a way. But then the experience of the atmosphere is something different, and that has a political relevance when we talk about pollution, because who sets the standard of how this kind of experience and exposure to pollution should be measured. I also love this idea of a single-use visualization about single-use plastic. And finally, then this idea that this focus on the qualities of phenomena in the world and their metaphorical or rhetorical dimension. I think it's a very interesting provocation to say that, and that we are not really thinking about data. We are always thinking about imaginaries that are built around or encapsulate data in some way, and the metaphors plus the data shape these imaginaries, and of course many other things. So these kind of questions to think about material properties, not just as objective facts in the world, but as metaphorical, as things that have some kind of metaphorical valence, in the sense that something is breaking or something is expanding, is, I think, touches also on all of these questions that we received from the audience. So I want to briefly talk about some of pose some of these questions to you. Maybe you have some response. So, for example, one practical question is, how can policymakers take into consideration the material turn of data into the local policies, and how can they be aware of that, and how can they make people aware of that? Maybe I'm just gonna, ask it into the round, whoever wants to respond to that, because I think a lot of policy relevant questions come up here.
I mean, I can answer briefly. We discussed this quite a bit with the plastic project, and kind of how is this actionable? Were we to scale these events, or kind of invite local influencers, for example, on Bali, to encourage either more activities like this, data-driven installations or cleanups, like, kind of thinking about aspects of scale and what that can do for, pushing, at least from a public pressure perspective, cleaning rivers, kind of dealing with waste before it ends up in rivers and kind of onward up the chain. So kind of a bottom-up approach, which I assume, could work for at least other environmental and other social projects.
I tend to argue, if I'll chime in for a sec to piggyback on that, I tend to argue that in civic settings with policymakers, because of this speaking data issue that I was trying to sort of dig into, that a responsibility among policymakers is to communicate more effectively with data and meet people where they are. I often tell a story about a community meeting I was in locally where on the screen they were sharing a 2-axis scatter plot that was animated over time in a public meeting to talk about some school data. And just even in the United States, I look around the room, the literacy to understand that, like, it's just not there, right? Even if you narrate it very well, it's still complicated, and that wasn't narrated well. So that to me is a gap. That's a gap where policymakers need to learn how to communicate with information more effectively to the audiences they're talking to.
Maybe I could just add to that with the policy aspect. I mean, I think there's something even like the comment that Paul Kahn has added in the chat around the William Playfair idea of visualizing the money that's spent on, for example, the Navy in that case. I think there's something actually about physicalizing the structure of policy itself. So if there were better ways of putting into practice the way that, so people could understand the way that government makes decisions, it's certainly things like the way that money flows within, within public spending or corruption and so on, I think could be quite a powerful thing. Sorry, my internet connection's not very good.
I think connected to that as well is this idea that some of these data physicalizations can be really public and really mediagenic. So that provides an opportunity for community groups or nonprofits as well to use them as a way to gather attention to these issues and to share data in a way that's very visible, even if that acts against some other group's interests.
So related to that, there's a very clever question asking us to talk about the materiality of data versus the materiality of an organization. I don't know if anyone has thoughts about that. Because in a way, like, I mean, I see this very much in all of your works that, we are not talking just about material properties of objects, but also about, the practices in organizations that generate data. And that has, like, material implications. For example, me sitting in my bedroom in front of Zoom versus coming to campus. And that definitely has changed how, we have these kind of panels and things like that.
Dietmar, can you repeat the original question?
It was a question to comment on the materiality of data versus the materiality of an organization. That is basically what is written there.
I mean, I think, like, organizations impact our lives, right? And one connective thread I see in all of our discussion was the fact that we've sort of named this thing that is data, that is a picture, a snapshot, and a recording of some, not all cases, but in many cases, some human phenomenon, right? And then we capture it, and we think that helps us understand it better and speak better to it, and operate on the world in some more informed way. And of course, along the way, we lose the fact that that's actual data, and that data was actually people. But as Dan talks about, like, we externalize it in some way to talk about it and think about it and impact. And I think that like, an organization is a very similar thing, right? We might try to make it very abstract and say, oh, it's a thing that operates on the world, but in fact, it's a bunch of people that make decisions. And we like to externalize that and say, oh, this organization is doing this, their approach is that, their impact is that, when in fact, it's a bunch of people making decisions. So that's one connective thread I see, that like maybe that, like it's actually like you can argue that we're talking about materiality, but in fact like those are artifacts of humanity more than anything else.
Absolutely. So we also have a lot of questions that deal with the practicalities of working as a designer with data and with material forms of data. So for example, one question I think all of you have answered through your presentations was that, how do you address potential criticisms that physical data tends to be static? And I think what we've seen is like, your work is anything but static. But I understand and I appreciate that this is a challenge that designers sometimes try to wrap their heads around.
I mean, I can just say, having made a couple more static physical visualizations for my MFA there at Northeastern, that's, I think Raul said earlier, like if you don't speak the language of data, how you're not going to be able to interpret it or understand it. And I think the whole point of a lot of these visualizations is to think more in a kind of pragmatist approach of like, okay, how did we, not necessarily in our like academic framework growing up that was like, based on the Industrial Revolution. At recess, it's all about freedom and engagement and, knowledge sharing in a very different way. And I feel like data physicalization and materiality bring us back to that in terms of, okay, but we do care about data, and we do care about these contexts, and how do we blend all of these things with engagement? And I think all of us are really thinking about meaningful engagement in different ways that, I would love to see physical data visualization about everything and how you interpret that and what the actual materiality is of the data representation, I think is really exciting. So
I think one of the interesting dynamic aspects, I think, can be things that are designed to reveal over time what's actually happening to them. So, if you think about even basic things like seeing something wearing out, or something that's designed to wear out, or something that's designed so that, I don't know, even like a pen where you can see how much ink is left in it because it's transparent, right? That kind of process, which is, is dynamic data physicalization, if you really want to look at it in that way. If we could do that with other things, and we could see over time, in real time or in summary or in some form, how the effect of things in a way that was planned to have that dynamic aspect to it. I just think there's a lot of potential for that. And it just requires a slightly different way of thinking about things. It might require designing things that, deliberately break or deliberately deteriorate, or maybe the other way around. Maybe they intentionally accrete extra stuff on them, or kind of, that kind of thing. And I don't think it's that difficult. I just think it's not necessarily the mindset that we're normally in when talking about visualizing data or representing data. I mean, I'd love to see almost like analog computing as an approach come back in a bigger scale, like the idea that you might be able to almost use aspects of the world as analogs for other things and plan it in that way. I think has a huge amount of potential, but it's just kind of difficult to think about, I guess, but there's something there.
Yeah, that's a great point to say that, well, okay, maybe physicalization normally doesn't have this instant responsiveness of interactive data visualization, but it works on a different time scale, and it works on a time scale that like interactive data visualizations cannot do anything about. I mean, there are some really interesting projects by artists such as John Gerard, who like makes animations that take years and decades to finish, but this shows that this is a time scale that is not accessible for our understanding of dynamic design. Because I think I want to be mindful of people who need to go to other classes and lunch maybe. So I want to conclude with an issue. So there are a lot of questions that relate again to how can material data specifically, be used to improve urban well-being, citizens' engagement, rising economic inequality. I mean, of course, you're talking about very, very big topics here, but in the end, like it's about the bigger relevance of what we are doing, and where would you see the particular maybe mindset or perspective that helps us address some of these issues in a different way.
I think I'll chime in here. I would actually, I'd love, Laura, if I can put you on the spot, I'd love you to chime in about the sort of experiences you've created in that realm that try to tackle some of these big issues. I've certainly learned a lot from that work and the sort of social engagements and the power of spectacle that you use to tackle environmental issues and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's certainly an angle of expanding access to open data. So this idea that open data has been really big. There's all these websites now that have these CSVs or Excel files with information. But the question, as many folks have brought up today, is who can access that and how. So I've done a few installations, including one with Sarah Wiley at Northeastern, where we tried to make that data more physical and turn it into a performance in a public space that was accessible to the community, and also created a space for conversations with other stakeholders on these issues. So perhaps that's one example of how taking this data and putting it into the space where people can have these conversations might start to shift some of the power dynamics.
Do you have any? Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I along those lines with Laura, the last couple of years I've worked for Thyssen-Bornemisza Art Contemporaries, TB21 Academy, for this platform called oceanarchive.org. And it's a place kind of trying to be as interdisciplinary and as inclusive as possible, in this case, just about the ocean, so exclusive of land, but thinking about climate change, sea level rise, and kind of a place to be archiving policy papers as well as academic papers, given by authors, and as well as, kind of images of, gallery images of sea level rise, physicality, kind of people where they've beamed out lasers where in Venice where, or put in light installations where we will see sea level rising in years to come. And I think those may seem more passive rather than dynamic, kind of chalk. We've seen these things a lot of places, chalk where sea level rise will be in a certain time. But I think more and more of that type of kind of civic engagement, making workshops and kind of events surrounding a lot of these types of, whether it's dance or theater or making sculptures together, I think I think I've been part of these data quizzing workshops with Moritz and Susan Jaschko, and you have too. And I think that the idea of creating a metaphor even for what happens when we engage and think about this data differently in space is, you're going to remember that much more than if you see, a pie chart in the newspaper.
Yeah, I mean, I think representing climate change is this kind of perennial issue that people have been talking about for, I don't know, 20 years. And there are all kinds of complicated explanations of why it doesn't seem to work and people don't seem to care. And as Dan points out in the chat, now it visualizes itself. I mean, it's here and everyone notices it. So, but yeah, I don't want to end on such a depressing note. But just to say thank you again to all of you. I mean, it was really interesting, and we were, as Skye wrote in the title of her talk, we were just able to just skim the surface barely, but I think there's much more to talk about, and yeah. I'm also glad to, to this really interesting audience and, all the interest in this conversation. Paulo, do you want to say a final word?
Yeah, I mean, just thank you again, everyone. the organization, people connected, was great. I mean, that's really about design. So, but it's product design, is environmental design, is architecture, is all of that. So it seems clear that that's the kind of design we need for data for data to make sense, especially with people, with society. And that's, I think, it's a good sign, a good message for the Center for Design and for design as a discipline. So thank you, everyone, and just stay tuned for the next conversation. Will be in a month. It will be about game design and health. I think another very interesting combination of for a interdisciplinary design research area that is very promising. So thank you, everyone, once again, and yeah, see you in a month, hopefully.
Thank you.